Hi friends, how are you today? I'm just popping in here really quick to let you know that today's episode is a little different from our normal Monday upload. That's because I'm taking a little time off in May, to recharge and go outside and smell fresh air. Maybe get some vitamin D, I'm not sure yet. But I still want to bring you guys some, some true crime stories while I'm gone. So I'm going to share an episode from the Murder Mystery Makeup podcast, and this story has never been seen on my YouTube channel before. Today I'm going to tell you about Marc Sappington, also known as the Kansas City Vampire. Listen, he went on a sudden killing spree back in 2001, and the details are terrifying, okay? We've got mysterious voices ordering murders, some truly insane drugs I have never even heard of before, and of course, cannibalism. Yeah. I'll be back in June with some brand new murder mysteries for you guys, but until then, maybe check out the podcast and listen to some, audio exclusives if you really want, if you really miss me. You can find it on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to podcasts. So, buckle on in, kitty cats. This one is a wild ride. Hi, just popping in here to mention today's sponsor. I've talked about this a few times, but when I was in my 20s, I had a job. Well, I've worked retail most of my life, okay? And minimum wage, okay? They're just scraping by, And I constantly had to play the game of do I get gas or groceries? It was always gas because I needed to get to work. So, of course, I then got introduced to credit cards and I had no understanding of how they really worked. I know. Okay. And then of course, I got behind on a lot of payments and it was a lot. It's a lot. It's hard. Well, then what had happened was it got so bad that it went through this whole process and then my wages started getting garnished. I didn't even know they could do that. And they sure as hell did. They garnished my wages. So I was barely making enough to survive. And on top of that, they were taking 25% from my check. I was wrecked. I was wrecked. I felt totally helpless and had no one to turn to. Okay. What do you do? Rob a bank? I was like, that sounds good. I honestly could have used a company like PDS Debt to help me navigate all of that. PDS Debt has customized options for anyone struggling with credit cards, personal loans, collections, or medical bills. And not only that, PDS Debt understands your specific scenario and will help provide alternative solutions to becoming debt-free. There's no minimum credit score required. They're here to help you save more, pay off your debt faster, and start putting money back where it belongs, in your pocket, hopefully in savings. But that's hard too, but back in your pocket. PDS Debt is A+ rated by the Better Business Bureau, boasts thousands of 5-star reviews on Google, and holds a 5-star rating on Trustpilot. Why? Because PDS Debt has helped hundreds of thousands of people get out of debt. Listen, you're 30 seconds away from being debt-free. Get your free assessment and find the best option for you right now at pdsdebt.com/Bailey. That's pdsdebt.com/Bailey. pdsdebt.com/Bailey. Thank you. Now let's get back to today's story. Today's story is about a vampire. Oh yes. This time it is about the Kansas City Vampire. His name is Marc Sappington. Have you heard of him? Now, Marc is not the stereotypical vampire that you tend to think of, many think of a modern vampire as goth, dressing in dark clothing. Maybe they're wearing spooky makeup. Or maybe they do some blood rituals. Because if there's no blood involved in some way, are you even really a vampire? Well, Marc wasn't like that at all, but he does do the whole blood drinking thing. And then some. Well, let's get into Marc's story, huh? Marc Vincent Sappington was born on February 9th in 1978, and he grew up on the north side of Kansas City. Now, this part of town was pretty religious, but it also, I guess it wasn't the safest. The most common sounds that you would hear in this area would be church bells and police sirens. It was the kind of place where Sunday preachers would paint really vivid pictures of hell during their sermons and would say that you didn't have to go very far outside the church parking lot to experience hell. Kansas City at this time was going through a massive crime spree, and nothing the cops did seemed to make a dent in lowering the crime rate. So in this neighborhood where thousands of decent people are trying to scrape by, a lot of them were single mothers, and Marc's mom, Mary White, she was one of them. And she did everything she could to try to keep Marc out of trouble and away from a life of crime and violence. Since Marc's dad just up and disappeared before Marc was even born, she turned to the church to help raise her son. She hoped that taking Marc to church every Sunday would help teach him strength and values in a way she knew his father never would. And for a while, it seemed to work. Marc stayed out of trouble and became a choir boy, spending his time at the church rather than out in the streets. So Marc is hanging with the church, and for the most part, he's a pretty good kid, and things are super normal, He's not a great student, but he's smart, he's articulate, and some would say he was pretty funny. He had a quick wit and a smile that paired with his quiet charm, and it would just kind of draw you in. But then, just as his mom feared, Marc started getting sucked into hanging out with the wrong crowd, and he starts getting into some drug habits. Marc was into smoking something called danks, which is street slang for cigarettes that are soaked in embalming fluid, dried, and then smoked. Yes, embalming fluid. For those of you who don't know, embalming fluid is the mixture of chemicals that are used to preserve dead bodies. It's chemicals, okay, and it keeps bodies from decaying in funeral homes or in medical labs. It's stuff that you don't want to be putting into your body while you're alive. So the reason that people would be smoking embalming fluid, I guess it would give you you would hallucinate. You would see stuff, okay? I had to look it up because I was like, why is someone smoking embalming fluid? What a weird combination. Who thought of that? I've got a lot of questions about dank alone, okay? But that's not what the story's about. Okay, so he's smoking that, and dank wasn't the only drug that Marc was using. He also got into angel dust, or PCP, which is a serious hallucinogen. Now, PCP is sometimes added to the embalming fluid used to make danks, so that could be how maybe Marc got into it. Originally, PCP was used in the 1950s as an anesthetic, but because it has some really serious side effects, doctors stopped using it for medical purposes. But people loved it. People loved it, and they loved how it distorted sights, colors, and sounds. And it just changed your whole environment, man. So Marc, he's smoking danks and using PCP, and it's not uncommon for him to have some run-ins with the police. But at this point, he hasn't really gotten himself into any serious trouble yet. That is, not until March of 2001. Now, this Armando guy is everything Marc's mom wanted him to stay away from. This is the kind of guy she feared Marc would end up by living in their neighborhood. Armando sees himself as a bit of a tough guy who believes he should live by the code of the street. But he's not actually involved with any gangs at this time, which means he's got to do something to prove himself and prove that he can roll with the big boys. In March, Armando and Marc get their hands on an assault rifle. To them, this gun was beautiful. It's the ultimate weapon for a tough guy on the streets. It's the kind of gun that could elevate their status in the way that they were looking for. But the only way to make that happen was to actually use it. So Armando comes up with a plan that will get them the status that they're looking for. The plan is to pull off an armed robbery. Now, there's no particular target in mind, but Armando tells Marc that any random dude will get the job done. And that's how they find David Marchak, owner of one of the local auto dealerships, when Armando goes in to buy a car. So Armando bought a 1984 Chevy Impala from David's dealership on March 5th, 2001. But David warned Armando that the tags weren't right, so he should leave the car parked until it gets sorted out. Then 2 days later, a cop pulls Armando over because the 30-day tags had been altered, and legally shouldn't be on the road. So the cop ends up having his car impounded. Well, Armando is pissed that his new car is now, in the impound. So on March 10th, Armando calls David to complain and make him pay to get the car towed out of the lot because he believed it was the dealership's fault that the tags were wrong. Now, because of Armando's beef with David for selling him a car with faulty tags, Armando decides that David will be their target. Armando's plan was pretty simple. They are just gonna walk up to David, they're gonna show him the gun and demand cash to get his car out of the impound. Armando would do the talking and Marc would flash the rifle. I mean, that was it. Very clean, no fuss, and that was it, period. Thank you. So on March 16th, 2001, the guys roll up to the car dealership around 2 p.m. and Armando goes in first. David is having lunch with one of his employees, but otherwise, the place was empty. So Armando goes in. He's super riled up, and he starts harassing David about getting his car out of the impound lot. David tells his employee, just ignore this guy, enjoy your lunch, whatever. So Armando, he's, I guess, annoyed. He decides to walk out. Then Marc, wearing a black mask and a black coat with a hood, enters the dealership. And then something happens that's not part of the plan. For seemingly no reason at all, Marc opens fire. The employee is able to make his escape out of the office and into the back garage area, like diving under a car. But David was not as lucky. He was shot inside the dealership. After about 10 minutes, the employee feels safe enough to emerge from under the car and call 911 while David lies on the floor, awake and conscious, but dying. Meanwhile, a customer from the audio store across the street heard the shots and ran outside, and he was able to witness Marc shooting David while Armando ran to get the car before the two sped off. Now, using the gun was never part of the plan, so after that, Armando fled to Texas while Marc stayed in Kansas City. Armando was eventually arrested a little while later, but refused to tell the police the shooter's identity. Now, you're probably like, hey, Bailey, I thought this was a story about vampires. What's going on? Well, shut up. We're getting to it right now. So Armando has left Marc in Kansas City, but Marc hasn't really left the drug and gang life. Now, here's the thing about PCP. It's a hallucinogen, right? But it can also make people feel paranoid or even psychotic. And around this time, Marc is starting to hear voices in his head, which is also known as auditory hallucinations. And these voices are telling Marc to eat flesh and blood or he would die. Yeah, the voices would kill him. Hallucination or not, that was really scary. Now, despite Marc's religious upbringing, there didn't seem to be a fear of God mixed in with all of this. A lot of times when someone hears voices, there is a divine nature attached to that voice. People believe they are getting these commands from God or Satan, or sometimes both. Marc never claims any of that. He only says he was afraid of punishment, that he feared for his own life if they didn't do as they said. Now, as controlling as these voices were, they didn't set up any rules regarding the eating of the flesh and the drinking of the blood, when to kill or what to do after. Who the victims were, that was up to Marc. And kind of like his first crime with Armando, Marc's approach was more of a leave it to chance and let the victim be a random target in the moment. So in March of 2001, Marc starts walking around the streets of Kansas City, and as he passes by people, he kind of asks himself, what about him? What about her? But the voices never seem to be satisfied with any of these people. So Marc is searching for 3 weeks before he finally finds his first victim that will hopefully get the voices to shut up, even if it's just for a little bit. Originally, Marc planned on finding a random stranger, but for some reason, he ends up settling on a friend from his neighborhood. Terry T. Green, who is 25 years old, had been a longtime friend of Marc's. They often hung out at each other's places, so it wasn't weird for Marc to come home on April 7th, 2001, and find Terry hanging out on his front steps. And poor Terry, this was a real case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Marc was coming home from going on one of his hunting walks, and when Marc sees Terry, he said the voices took over. They told him to lure Terry to the basement of his house and then attack Terry with the hunting knife Marc has hidden in one of the corners of the basement. And so Marc makes up some excuse and was like, "Hey man, I got this thing in the basement. You just gotta see it." And Terry was like, "Okay, cool, man." So then he lures him down into the basement and then attacks Terry. Now, killing someone with a knife, I would assume, is way different than killing someone with a gun. And at this point, Marc had never killed someone with a knife before. So when he kills Terry, it's kind of this high energy thing. And Marc is just splattering the walls with poor Terry's blood. Then, once Terry was lying dead on the ground, the voices gave the next command. They were telling him to drink his blood. So Marc kneels down and starts to lap up the blood, kind of like an animal. But he isn't able to finish this task the voices had given him because he hears some noises and is afraid of getting caught. And he later says that the voices tell him to get rid of the body immediately. Now, Marc is kind of panicked. Obviously, I don't know, maybe because he just killed his friend, and decides that he needs to get rid of the body and fast. So he puts the body in the back seat of Terry's car, covers it up with a blue tarp, and drives across the river to Kansas City, Missouri. I know this is a side note, but the fact that there's a Kansas City, Kansas, and then a Kansas City, Missouri is the most questionable thing in America, period. Thank you. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. What is that about? Now, this next part isn't the smartest move, but remember, he's probably still high on PCP. So Marc decides that he's going to leave the car with Terry's body in it at the edge of a parking lot at a nightclub that he and Terry often went to, and then he takes a taxi home. 3 days later, on April 10th, the Missouri police find Terry's body and start looking into the homicide. But lucky for Marc, they're not looking in the right spot. Now, the Kansas police are also kind of like breathing a sigh of relief because this new murder was not in their own state. Because if the body had been found in Kansas City, Kansas, rather than Kansas City, Missouri, police, probably not, but maybe they would have linked it to David's death over at the car dealership, which would have meant that they had a spree killer on their hands. But I hate to give police that much credit because we see time and time again on Murder Mystery Makeup that the police never want to connect the dots. Ever. Earlier that same morning on April 10th, Marc, I guess he smoked some drugs. He doesn't remember if it was dank or PCP. But then he goes over to his best friend Eric Phoenix's house really early in the morning. He's on drugs, so he doesn't really have an awareness of time or what's an acceptable hour to visit people's houses. Eric was living with his wife, his mother, and his younger stepbrother, whose name is Michael Weaver. Everyone is asleep when Marc arrives. He knocks on the door, wakes up Eric's mom, who answers, and she's like, "Marc, what are you doing here? It's so early in the morning, And Marc tells her, "I need to borrow a screwdriver." And she's like, "Okay, go look in the kitchen." And then she heads back to bed. So Marc hangs out for a little bit. He watches some TV and then goes upstairs to grab a jacket, apparently. And then runs back downstairs and into the backyard, grabbing a knife off the kitchen counter on his way out. Marc hangs out in the backyard for a bit and then starts to hear the voices again. This time, they gave him a deadline. Marc remembers, quote, "I heard the voices tell me it's do or die. If I don't eat, I'm going to die within 6 or 7 hours." End quote. So Marc's hanging out in the backyard at his buddy Eric's house when the voices give Marc this deadline. And a few minutes later, Eric's stepbrother, Michael, comes outside. Well, Marc, he has his marching orders, and he sees Michael and is thinking, well, Michael will have to do. So using the knife Marc took from the kitchen, he stabs Michael in the back. But I guess the blade was pretty long because the knife goes completely through this poor man's chest. Michael tries to get in the car and drive away from Marc, but he crashes into a light pole. Marc sees this as an opportunity to try and give the voices what they want and drink Michael's blood. But the car crash wakes up one of the neighbors, who ends up calling the cops. Now, it's not long before Marc can hear police sirens coming his way. Marc tries to move the car away from the scene and is able to move it a little ways away before just abandoning it in an alley a few blocks from his house. Now, the death of Michael is significant because this is Marc's official third kill. He is now classified as a serial killer. According to the rules, you have to kill 3 in order to be considered a serial killer. So Marc is on his way home when he spots a 16-year-old named Freddie Brown. Now, Freddie looks up to Marc. He sees Marc like a big brother. Well, poor Freddie happens to also be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The voices tell Marc that Freddie is now the new target. So Marc is like, hey, Freddie, you want to come to my house and smoke some wet? I had to look up what wet is. I guess wet is like dank, but instead of it being a tobacco cigarette, it's got marijuana, and it's either dipped in fluids or laced with something else. Wet. Either way, not great. Not great. Not a great role model either. So Marc's like, hey, you want to come smoke some wet? And because Freddie pretty much idolizes Marc, he's like, yeah. So like Terry, Marc lures Freddie down to the basement. But this time Marc switches up his method. He shoots Freddie in his back with a shotgun. Blood explodes everywhere. But this time, Marc seems to finally be free of distractions. He's finally able to drink Freddie's blood like the voices wanted him to. But this time, Marc doesn't stop at the blood. The voices in his head are telling him now to consume flesh. So Marc does just that. He butchers Freddie's body, cutting off the arms and the legs before eating a small part of Freddie's leg raw. He makes Marc feel kind of sick, and instead of thinking maybe I feel sick because I'm eating, a leg, he thinks it's because the flesh is raw, so he decides to try and fry it and try it that way. I guess frying the flesh was better because Marc finishes. It's not funny. It's just I know. It's not funny. It's just so wild. It's not funny. It's not funny. I'm not laughing at that. It's just awkward and what? Because he fries the flesh and Marc finishes the piece and drinks some of Freddie's blood. So, yep. With the voices finally satisfied, at least for the moment, Marc stuffs what was left of Freddie in a trash bag, but leaves his leftovers on the floor. Marc ends up leaving the basement a wreck and goes for a walk to, maybe digest his meal? Or maybe he just wants to finally be able to go for a walk without the voices making him turn it into a hunt. So Marc is on a walk. He's out, His mom comes home a few hours later, and guess what? She goes down to the basement and she's like, what the hell? It's covered in blood. Now, normally his mom doesn't go into the basement, but she spots the trail of blood drops near the cellar. She opens the door and sees more blood on the cellar stairs, so she decides to follow them and investigate. Well, Mom not only gets a huge surprise, but she also gets a bird's eye view of the crime scene from the stairs. She immediately calls the cops. So, Marc's pretty sure the cops are after him because he left a giant crime scene in his basement for his mom to find. But also, he's probably high, or at least experiencing the delayed side effects from the PCP and is super paranoid. Anyway, at around 9:30 p.m. on April 10th, the same day he killed both Michael and Freddie, Marc runs into one of the women who lives in the neighborhood named Anita Washington. Anita is just getting home from the grocery store and was sitting in her driveway when Marc knocks on her window. She looks at him and sees he's pointing a gun directly at her. He climbs in the backseat of her car and tells her to drive to Kansas City, Missouri. She does what he says and, they start driving. Meanwhile, Marc just keeps saying, "I'm a dead man," over and over again. And at some point, Marc decides it's better if he drives, so he has her pull over. Anita, being the smart woman that she is, takes this opportunity to run away, and she does. She runs to the nearest house. She runs up to this house and she's telling these people, "I just had my car jacked by a guy with a gun. I need to call the police." Marc gives the cops a good chase for a bit, but eventually they were able to arrest him on April 12th. So police have arrested Marc for the carjacking, and they've got him in the interrogation room for hours. But no matter what they say, Marc is dead silent. He doesn't say a peep. The police are thinking to themselves, there's got to be a way to get him to talk. There's always one question using the right words and the right tone that will crack him and make him open up. Well, it looks like Marc is about to win this round, so police are getting ready to put on their coats and go home when they hear Marc's voice. At first, they weren't sure that they actually heard Marc say anything, but then Marc repeated the words, "vampirism, cannibalism." All right, case closed, Now, originally the cops thought that they had this guy in for a carjacking, so they were a bit taken aback. And rightfully so. They don't know what to say. So, I don't know, Marc just starts talking, and he starts at the beginning, telling them about the voices. And now that Marc had broken his silence, he just kept talking and talking and talking. He ended up confessing to the murder of Terry, who Missouri police thought was an isolated incident. And he confessed to the murder of his friends Michael and Freddie. Marc goes into a super detailed and really emotional recounting of his crimes. He talked about how he drank his victim's blood and ate Freddie's flesh. The scariest part for police was Marc's kind of nonchalant attitude when it came to picking victims. To them, there was no method to his madness. The victims could have been anybody. Marc would ask himself, what about him? Or what about her? As people passed him by. And these people were totally clueless. They were barely escaping being killed and potentially eaten. Yuck. Sometimes, this is a side note, sometimes I'm I would love to have that superpower where I can read people's minds. But then do you really want to read people's minds? Do you really want to read people's minds? One of the weird things was that once Marc started talking, he was just on a roll. Not only did he tell them everything, but he would later take them to where he dumped the keys to Michael's car, as well as where he dumped the keys to Terry's car. So the question on the police's mind was, what kept Marc quiet for so long? Detectives think that maybe it could have been shame. Maybe Marc had some remorse for what he did. So Marc is in jail, and bail is set for $2 million. But investigators are starting to realize there's more to all of these murders than meets the eye. Marc undergoes a series of psychological and psychiatric tests, but it turns out Marc had been suffering from schizophrenia since he was 16, and it had only gotten worse as he's gotten older. Plus, adding PCP to the mix did not help. It turned out that his mother also had schizophrenia. Bummer. So he probably didn't even realize it, huh? So between the drug use, his history, and his family history of mental illness, the defense claimed that Marc was incapable of the required criminal intent to commit the charged offenses. So Marc pleaded not guilty by reason of mental disease. Over the next 3 years, the trial kind of starts and stops based on Marc's periods of competency. Ultimately, Marc is deemed competent to stand trial, and it started in July of 2004. His first trial was for the death of Terry, Michael, and Freddie, as well as the carjacking. He would later be tried separately for the death of David. During his first trial, the prosecution plays Marc's hour-long confession tape for the jury, where Marc confessed to stabbing Michael Weaver to death, leaving Terry Green's body in his car in Missouri, and shooting Freddie Brown before dismembering his body and eating a small piece of his leg. Could you imagine sitting as a jury member and you're listening to someone describe eating a person's leg? Yeah, me neither. Me neither. During this interview tape, the jury also hears Marc ask if he could chomp on the cop's leg. So, just wasn't a good look. Wasn't really going to help his case much. So prosecutors kind of doubt the story about the voices, even though the doctors say he suffers severe mental illness, since it seems to them that Marc only heard the voices when he was high on PCP. But that fact aside, prosecutors did not seek the death penalty. Instead, they hoped that maybe Marc would be sentenced to life in a mental hospital where he could get help and treatment. After an hour of deliberation, the jury would find Marc guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and the count of kidnapping and aggravated burglary. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms for the murders, 79 months for the kidnapping, and 32 months for the aggravated burglary. On December 10, 2004, Marc was convicted of attempted aggravated robbery and for the murder of David at his auto dealership in March of 2001. He was sentenced to life in prison. Basically, this guy's never getting out of jail. He's never getting out of jail. He was convicted of everything. During this time, Marc also began taking medication for his schizophrenia. So I guess the bright side is like, hey, he's in prison, but at least like the voices are quiet. There's something positive for him to think about. I don't know why I'm trying to find a bright side for this murderer, but yeah, I don't know. So in addition to the families of the victims being devastated by the damage Marc did, neighbors kind of had a weird reaction to Marc and his crimes. They initially felt that Marc wanted to go out like a legend, that he wanted to be like Jeffrey Dahmer, a serial killer known for eating his victims. During Marc's sentencing for the 3 murders, the judge told Marc, quote, "You are the closest thing to a homicide time bomb there is," end quote. And I think many could agree there because between his untreated schizophrenia and his drug use, it was like fueling these voices in his head. Who knows how many more people Marc would have killed if he hadn't been caught. He would have been caught eventually. He was messy, right? Thank God he got caught. And that, my friends, is a story about the Kansas City vampire. Marc Sappington will be locked up for the rest of his life and pay for his crimes. I don't know what else there is to say. Don't do drugs. Shit. These poor people died for no damn reason, right? Jeez. I'd love to know your thoughts. Do you have any? What do you say? I don't know. Well, thanks for hanging out with me today. I hope you have a good rest of your day. You be safe out there, please. You make good choices. And I'll be seeing you guys later. Goodbye.